Yeah, so our title is a mouthful, but this is a community-based approach to wildfire preparedness planning for the Storm Mountain community in Larimer County, Colorado. I'm Jonah, and this is Katie. And so we really spent our summer trying to get to know this community, to gather some of their values, needs, and preferences surrounding wildfire planning, so that we could make recommendations for them and also try to encourage engagement and participation in the planning process. So I'll give it over to Katie to give a little more introduction.
Great. So thanks, Jonah. And like Jonah just said, we got to know the Storm Mountain community this summer, and you all will too during this presentation. But just to give you a quick introduction, Storm Mountain is located in the Big Thompson Canyon, and it's actually near the town of Drake, if you know where that is. And it's made up of 4 neighborhoods. They go by the name of Storm Mountain, Cedar Park, Cedar Springs, and Cedar Creek. And so the community does go by some different names, but we think Storm Mountain is the most common way that community members refer to the whole community. And so that's what we're going to be using in this presentation. So the thing that connects all 4 of these neighborhoods together is that they all share one single access road from up in the community down to the main highway, US 34. So you can see that one single access road highlighted in yellow here on this map. And then just a couple of other quick little facts about the community to help you get going. It's made up of 500 to 600 residents. And there's a mixture of part-time and full-time residents who live in the community. And we also see a couple of different levels of governance here in the community. Of course, there's lots of private landowners. And with that, there's a neighborhood HOA. There's also a public improvement district that focuses on roads in the community and is community member run. But there's also national forest land that surrounds the community. So there's also some federally owned land there. And another really important part of the community is the Loveland Fire and Rescue Volunteer Fire Department. And you can see them here on this slide that they're leading the 4th of July parade. The community has an annual 4th of July parade. You'll hear about that later. So anyway, the Volunteer Fire Department was very important to the community, and they're also very important to our project.
So all of those social systems that make up the community exist in what's called the wildland-urban interface. And I think a lot of us have heard this term, but that means that the community is in or near undeveloped forests. And in the case of Storm Mountain, those forests are made up of Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, aspen, and then at higher elevations, there are lodgepole pine. And there is quite a significant difference in elevation within the community. And with that, there is a significant variation in the hill slopes throughout the community. And that can contribute a lot in different areas to wildfire movement. There's also tributaries of the Big Thompson River. It is a part of the Big Thompson River watershed. So being in the wildland-urban interface kind of brings us to the issue that we want to discuss, and that is wildfire and wildfire risk. We want to make recommendations for this community to plan for wildfires while encouraging that engagement and participation. And a key piece of doing that is understanding your risk. So there are a lot of resources to help communities do this. One that we have here is the Colorado Wildfire Risk Viewer from the Colorado State Forest Service. And we've actually recommended use of this in our deliverable as well. But you can see, if you're more familiar with Drake, Colorado, that's labeled here, and Storm Mountain is just to the northeast of Drake. And on this map, higher wildfire risk is represented in red. So there is still some pretty significant risk of wildfire in the area. And that's important to note as we move forward.
Right, so and also to help you know more about this situation, why the wildfire risk is so bad in Storm Mountain, how we got here, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the social and ecological components. And first, we're going to start off by talking about wildfire in the past. So historically in this area, wildfire is natural and even necessary part of the ecosystem. And in North America, many indigenous peoples lived with and managed wildfire. However, when Europeans came and they colonized this area, they brought with them the perception that wildfire is bad and has to be suppressed and controlled in order to control the landscape. And so this perception was really solidified in the early 19th century due to US Forest Service policies and practices that involved putting out wildfire as soon as possible. I've got some examples of some of the promotional material the US Forest Service has made. And as a result, we are very good at putting out wildfire. So a couple of reasons those policies existed is to protect human life, especially as more people began living in the WUI. However, there's some unintended side effects of these policies, and that means that the structure of our forests have actually changed. So on this slide, you can see a picture on the left of what a forest area in the South Platte River, which is actually very ecologically similar to the Big Thompson Canyon, what it looked like in 1903. And then you can go compare that to the image on the right, 1999. And you can see right away that there's a tremendous difference. It used to be very open and trees were spread out. And now we've got really dense vegetation. And this is because without the presence of small and sometimes large wildfires that used to naturally occur in this area, as they would move through, they would burn up fuel. We now have an excess amount of fuel. So anyway, this amount of fuel, it contributes to the problem. And I'm going to explain about that. And also I'll be using this feedback loop. So this feedback loop is just one of probably many feedback loops within this system of why the wildfire problem is intensifying. It's the wildfire perception feedback loop. So it starts with our policies to put out wildfire as soon as possible, which means that most small wildfires are put out. But however, this policy has led to a buildup of fuel, like I just mentioned. And with that buildup of fuel, high intensity fires that are very destructive are now more likely to occur. So when a high intensity fire occurs, it again is very destructive, it's dangerous for human life, it's expensive to put out, it's also very damaging to the environment. So when these fires occur, and especially when these are the only fires that are occurring, it feeds back into the perception loop that wildfire should be suppressed always. So one really important way to break out of this loop, to keep the problem from intensifying, is to change our perception of wildfire. So communities need to start to learn to view wildfire as something to adapt to and live with. So this is also very important. Communities who, or individuals who have taken measures to make their homes more flame resistant to wildfire and make a defensible space around their home, often by thinning the trees around it, it actually increases their home survivability during a wildfire. So we saw this in practice during 2020. I think we all know that 2020 was a record-breaking year for wildfire in Colorado. The Cameron Peak fire occurred in 2020, the largest fire in Colorado's history. And the Cameron Peak fire did burn into parts of the Storm Mountain community, the northern part. However, there still is a large area around the community that has not been burned. So that means there still is a buildup of fuel in this community, meaning that there still is wildfire risk. Additionally, climate change is contributing to this problem. It's making conditions hotter and drier. It's also stressing out the forest. All in all, this is a very large, wicked problem, wildfire in Colorado. And we need to start finding, well, we have to have solutions to try to mitigate the risk of wildfire. So a couple of common solutions for mitigating risk is to treat the forest, usually by mechanically thinning it out, by removing trees from the forest. There can also be controlled burns is another common way. In this slide, you see on the left what an untreated forest looks like compared to a treated forest. You can see on the right that if a wildfire were to occur through the treated area, there isn't as much fuel to burn. So it would probably stay lower on the ground and remain a low intensity fire. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this kind of treatment is always labor and time, very much includes a lot of labor and time. It can also be expensive. So there's challenges for individuals to take on these actions. Additionally, there's other complexities, like if there is a steep hill slope, like Jonah mentioned, is common in Storm Mountain. Also, sometimes people's perceptions make this a challenge because some people prefer an untreated forest versus treated, even though treated is the natural and healthy state. It's also very important to keep in mind that once treatment occurs, it has to be maintained. Otherwise, the conditions will return to like they once were, as long as we keep suppressing wildfire. And so with that in mind, that kind of brings us to why community involvement is so important and the focus of our project. So when communities are part of the planning, they become part of the solution. Wildfire, again, is a very large problem, and there's going to be many different scales of action that we need to take to address it. But with individuals, it's critical to find solutions that are sustainable and long-term that community members can continue to do. And so experience has shown that when community members are part of the planning process, when they drive actions forward, they actually can make the best outcomes, and they can inspire their neighbors to do the same. And so this leads us to talking about our project partners for this project, the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition. So again, their input for this project was very critical, and they're a great organization. They started in 2013 following a very destructive flood in the Big Thompson Canyon. And they're a smaller organization, but they partner with private landowners and also public landowners, and they do restoration work. So the map that we have here shows some of the projects that BTWC has taken on. And this is actually not an up-to-date map. They've done even more projects. But you can see that the blue dots are all of the river restoration work, because again, that's where BTWC started. But they have now started to take on more and more forest restoration works, because the forest is so important to the health of the ecosystem, and also because of the need of the community. So a couple of the recent BTWC projects includes a Capstone project with a CLTL member from Cohort 9 named Maddie Norman. She surveyed the preferences of community members in the Big Thompson Canyon in terms of communication. And they've also recently completed a thinning project within Storm Mountain.
And so that thinning project is one of a few projects that they are completing in Storm Mountain, hoping to kind of build some long-term relationships and projects in that community. And so another one is the project that we kind of fit into. And this is funded through coalitions and collaboratives. It's an AIM grant, and they're working with some other partners. But there's kind of two pieces of this project. There is community planning and defensible space demonstrations. I don't have to tell you about the whole thing, but in the interest of time, we fit into the community planning aspect. We are hoping to help this community or make recommendations for this community to plan for wildfire while encouraging community participation and engagement in that planning. So with that in mind, I want to introduce you a little bit to our deliverables, so you have some context of the activities that we took on. So our deliverable is a document to give to Storm Mountain community members, as well as the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition, that makes these recommendations based on their input and what we heard from the community to plan for wildfire. And all of those recommendations will also encourage that community engagement and participation, a phrase you're going to hear a lot more times throughout this presentation. But this document really has 4 parts. And the first is kind of an introduction to wildfire and discussion of wildfire risk in the area. The second part is kind of an overview of our project, our activities, and our findings. The third part is where we actually make these recommendations and give some more discussion and depth on those. And then the fourth part is in the form of appendices, but it's kind of a toolbox that includes resources that the community can use to help implement some of these recommendations. So with those broad goals in mind, we'll just give you kind of a mile-high view of our timeline. Much more went into it than this, but we kind of broke it down into 3 phases. And phase 1 was in May and June, and that was really our information gathering. We did our literature research, and we conducted some interviews with experts in the field, some semi-structured interviews. Then we went into phase 2, which was July and August, and that was really kind of the meat of our project, the actual community engagement and participation. And then phase 3, September through November, based on all of those findings and the information we gathered, we created these recommendations and designed our deliverable. So I'll let Katie talk a little bit about our main activities in phase 1.
Right, so activity in phase 1 was our expert interviews. So we conducted seven of these interviews, and with many experts and practitioners in the field that were recommended to us by Big Thompson Watershed Coalition. And we had 3 main topics for our interviews: wildfire preparedness, forest management, and especially outreach and engagement with community members when it comes to those first 2 items. So we had a couple of great takeaways from these interviews. The first one, though, what was important for the rest of our project was to consider all our options. So before these interviews, we had been focused on community wildfire protection plans, which are a great tool and pretty common in Colorado. But our interviews helped us realize that we needed to take a step back and to consider that there are actually many actions that communities can do to become more wildfire prepared. So by being able to take a step back, we'd also help to see the other options that community members can do, and they can help community members take more ownership of the process. Additionally, we talked about some of the aspects of successful plans of other similar communities who are trying to make a wildfire risk reduction program. And we learned that one of the really important factors of successful plans that turn into on-the-ground action are the presence of spark plugs. So spark plugs are what they call individuals who are really championing the process forward. So people in the community who are really involved and who are bringing others along with them. So identifying spark plugs in the community, these are another key learning we had. We also learned that successful plans are always actionable and that they also are tailored to the specific needs of the community. So finally, one of our main takeaways was, again, community engagement and participation is critical. This is, again, it's really important that community members feel ownership of the process. So they should be involved from the very beginning.
So that was kind of our main activity, aside from our literature research in phase 1. And then we jumped into this second phase, and we really kicked that off at the 4th of July cookout that Storm Mountain has every year. And they graciously let us set up our boring informational table at their fun event. And this really served as a good way for us to get kind of an introduction to the community and have some discussions with some residents and see some community dynamics in action. And we also got to ask some initial questions that helped us begin to plug into community values and where people's mindset is surrounding wildfire preparedness actions. So after the 4th of July, we kind of really ramped up our efforts and we hosted our first community meeting. And this one was kind of unique in that we invited specific residents and we refer to them as key community members. And they are people that we know have engaged with the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition in the past, or who have engaged in other community planning in the past. So for example, the public improvement district for the roads throughout the community. So we had 4 participants at this community, or at this community meeting, excuse me. And our goals really were to begin to gather those values, but also to hear from people who are most plugged into the community, what are good considerations and strategies for engaging the broader community moving forward. So we had some takeaways in that realm, and I'll just touch on a few, but the first one was understanding and communicating risk. To use that as a way to motivate people to engage is very important. Some of our attendees indicated that they felt like there was kind of a lowered risk perception among the community because the Cameron Peak fire had just happened. Kind of a perception that they had survived the big fire and now that risk had kind of passed, that danger. And unfortunately, that just is not true. We've both talked about there is still very high risk in the community. There's a lot of fuel in and around the community. So we took that forward and discussed risk in both of our further meetings and in our deliverable. Another takeaway here was that they felt like this issue feels really overwhelming, and it does feel that way. And so it was important for us to create some actionable steps within our recommendations that can help break the issue down a little bit more. And then finally, they really just helped us refine our questions for the broader community and our approach to engaging the broader community moving forward. So we had 2 more meetings that Katie will talk about.
Right, so our community meetings that were open to the entire Storm Mountain community, we had 2 of them. The first one was in person. We set up shop in the fire station. You can see in the picture that we put our slide and projector up against the fire truck. We also had a second meeting that was on Zoom in order to help more people attend if they felt more comfortable attending that way. We had about 8 people come to the in-person meeting and 5 people come to the Zoom meeting. And we designed the content of the 2 meetings to be very similar, where we started with a brief presentation. Jonah just mentioned that we learned that we should talk about the risk that still exists in the community, but we also talked about what other similar communities, what actions they have been doing. And some of that was what we learned from the practitioners we spoke to, but also from our own research. But the main purpose of our community meetings was to create a discussion and dialogue with our attendees. And we had a couple of major themes. Our questions that we asked are on the slide. We're not going to read them, but these were the questions that we refined from the key community meetings. And we had a couple of major categories. The first one was the values of the community. The next was action steps that a community can take. The third one was challenges that are facing the action steps. And there's also the assets that community has. So before we go forward, we are going to talk about our findings in more detail because they were very interesting. But we do have to say that we recognize that the participation of the people who came to the event was relatively low compared to the size of the full community. So it would definitely be worth some future events to engage more residents. There could be some gaps in our information that could be felt by other outreach with the community or internally by the community themselves. So I want to talk about our first findings, which are values of the community. So this is interesting, but it's also used often in planning. What are community values? It's also a nice way for community members to see where they have shared values with each other. The first major category of values that we heard was values relating to home and property. That makes sense. And then the second category of values were values related to the community, like the sense of community that people have in Storm Mountain. It was also, people told us that they liked that it was remote and hard to access, far away from the city. So finally, the third category were values related to nature, that people really appreciated the trees in the forest or the trails and seeing wildlife. People also said they loved the views of Storm Mountain, which I can confirm are amazing.
Yeah, so those are values that could be at risk. And Katie talked about the other categories that we had. And I'll just briefly touch on those. We had concerns, action steps, challenges, and assets. So meeting attendees identified a variety of concerns that could make them more vulnerable to wildfire. And these were things that ranged from community-wide issues to more individual level issues. So on the community side, things like a lack of organized leadership structure around wildfire, or the single access and emergency evacuation road. And then on the individual side, things like forest management or fuel mitigation on people's individual parcels. So with that in mind, we wanted to make sure some of our recommendations and actions addressed both community-wide actions and individual actions. However, as we want to encourage this engagement and participation, all of the individual recommendations that we make can also contribute to preparedness on a community level. So then with those concerns in mind, we asked them, what are some action steps that you can think of that would address some of those concerns? And these were pretty wide ranging as well. Forest and fire related skills trainings, education or volunteer cleanup crews for fuels. And these were very useful in informing some of our recommendations moving forward. This was a really great finding to kind of see where their mindset was as far as what were people willing or wanting to do. And they also were it's important to note that some of these could contribute to others as well, kind of a two birds with one stone situation, which is really useful. Like setting up wildfire meeting groups could give a forum or a place to have educational opportunities as well. So moving forward with one could help move forward with others. And then with those action steps in mind, we wanted to figure out what were some challenges that could impede or be barriers to taking those actions. And this might have had the most variation among everything we discussed, but people identified challenges that they've encountered in the past, challenges that could be a surprise if you don't identify them before you start, or challenges that might even prevent somebody from starting to take something on. So some examples, lacking the physical ability, knowledge, time, or resources, that might prevent somebody from even trying to initiate an activity. Whereas something like the mosaic of land ownership, and by that we mean there are so many different private landowners and multiple different public land entities in the area, kind of creating a mosaic of ownership. That could be something that if you don't identify that early on, it could surprise you in the process and make your process very difficult. So then we got into assets, and we really wanted to end our meetings on kind of a more positive note with some solutions in mind. So we had community members identify assets within the community that could be leveraged to help drive some of these recommendations or actions forward. So they identified assets in 4 different categories. And as we were organizing our information, we kind of identified a 5th category, which we will get to. But I'll start with those first 4. And the first one they identified were tangible resources. So pretty straightforward, but most residents have a chainsaw. People own big machinery like backhoes, wood chippers, and then also things like residents that have experience and knowledge of the area who might be willing to share that with others. The second category was community networks. So these could be more formal, like the Public Improvement District or the Cedar Springs HOA. That's one of the smaller communities, so it's not a full, or neighborhoods, it's not a full community HOA. Or relationships with the big Thompson Watershed Coalition or other outside organizations. And then some less formal ones like the Facebook group. There's a Facebook group. There's people communicating on the Nextdoor app. There's a Storm Mountain website and an email group. Our third category was preparedness and mitigation and things that are current and ongoing. So there is an existing community wildfire protection plan for the Loveland Rural Fire Protection District. And that is a useful document, but it's also a lot of area, the whole district. So something more specific to Storm Mountain might be useful for that community. Then there's also people doing individual work on their own property, BTWC projects, and the U.S. Forest Service has some mitigation projects going on around the area. Then the fourth category was the community's mental outlook or the community's mindset. And we got some conflicting messages here. But the first one people identified was that there is a sense of individualism within the community. A lot of folks have that kind of an individual mindset. And that does feel like a barrier initially, but we also felt like if there are people who have that individual mindset and want to go out and gain skills for themselves and learn for themselves, then if they might be willing to share those skills that they've gained, that could be an asset in itself. And then on the other hand, we also had people bring up that there is this sense that people want to be neighborly. They want to build networks with their neighbors and potentially offer assistance. And then that fifth category that we identified is previously existing assets. So a lot of these fell into the community networks, but they're things that don't exist anymore. So annual meeting, fuel cleanup days, and even a Taco Tuesday. Those could be events where you can network and share information. And then also a Storm Mountain community mailer. And so while these don't exist anymore, what this kind of indicated to us as an asset was that the community does have the capacity to create some of these networking or engagement opportunities. So this is a lot of stuff on this slide. Don't worry about taking it all in or reading it, but we want to now dive into our recommendations. And we just want to give you a visual of how we began to lay those out. So we started kind of with the mindset of the open standards of conservation results chains. We had a problem and we wanted to work backwards with steps on how to solve that, but we changed it quite a lot. It's been adapted pretty significantly. But each of these vertical paths represents a recommendation and they're all color coded. And then the boxes within them represent steps or action steps that can be taken to help implement that recommendation. You'll also see that every single one starts from one common location, and that is the spark plugs. We mentioned the importance of spark plugs, people who can champion the process, drive it forward, and encourage others to participate as well. So all of them begin there. And we organized it into 3 categories: mitigation activities, planning and preparedness, and educational opportunities. There is some crossover between these, but those are the 3 kind of main categories. And all of them will in some way encourage participation and engagement from community members. And we do recognize that it's a lot of recommendations. There are 10 total, but this is purposeful because we want the community to be able to choose what's best for them so that they can really take ownership of the process and drive it forward. So that was where we started with our recommendations. And then we broke it down. The flow chart, each recommendation refers to a page number. And if you go to that page, you'll find kind of a 1-pager style document that gives some more depth and description on what that recommendation is. As an overview, it has challenges the community might encounter that they identified when implementing this recommendation. It has community identified assets that could help with this recommendation, and then some outcomes and benefits that might be expected when implementing this. You'll also see in the top corner, there's a little chart, outcome, effort, and cost. And that's based on our research and our understanding of what this recommendation would entail, what level of effort and cost the community would need to put in, and what level of outcome they would get out from implementing this recommendation. That is general, and it can vary a little bit based on the action that's taken, and I'll give an example of that on our next slide. So with those in mind, we want to dive in and just give kind of a brief overview of each recommendation. In the interest of time, we'll try to keep that a little quick. But first, we'll go into these mitigation activities. And the first one here is volunteer fuel mitigation groups. This was brought up directly by community members as something that would be of interest. And it's just a volunteer group to get together and perform fuel mitigation on properties throughout the community. We recognize it would be a lot of work, and volunteers can't really mitigate fuel across the entire community. It's just too much area. But it could be kind of a long-term sustainable effort that could meet some needs over time while really encouraging engagement and participation. The second one is enhancing defensible space. And this is a really important action on an individual level, but it could also be, it could also contribute to preparedness on a community level, as the more people that create defensible space, the more protected the community as a whole will be. And there are a lot of actions that can be taken that can count as defensible space. There are checklists online, and we've provided some in our resources in the appendices of our deliverable. But they can be something as small as moving flammable materials away from your home, or clearing pine needles off of your roof so embers can't ignite them, to something as large as retrofitting your home with non-flammable materials or doing thinning on your property. And so this is a place where that effort, cost, and outcome scale, that could vary pretty widely based on what you decide to do. Ideally, you would do everything, but recognizing that people don't have the same level of resources or time, you can take on what you can take on. Then the last two on this slide are two types of recurring meetings. The first one is discussion, planning, and information sharing meetings. And while this isn't directly a mitigation activity, it can provide kind of a space for people to get together, plan, share ideas, and share information that could help lead to implementing other mitigation activities. And then the second recurring meeting is skills trainings, another thing directly brought up by meeting participants. So some examples would be safe chainsaw use for fuel mitigation, or shelter in place and evacuation trainings. And so these would provide one great opportunity for engagement, as if experts from within the community could be identified that could train, that would be a great way to get more people involved from within the community. And then both of these recurring meetings just are really great opportunities to bring people together to form that participation and engagement. And so Katie will jump into our next two categories.
Thanks, Jonah. So yeah, the next category is the planning and preparedness category. So the first recommendation in this category was improving evacuation and shelter in place knowledge, awareness, education. So this recommendation arose because when we spoke to community members, we learned that during the Cameron Peak fire evacuation, there was some confusion and frustration around evacuation. And it is critical that every person who lives in the WUI has their own personal evacuation plan. And it also is critical that Storm Mountain community members are aware of the policies and procedures that are specific to Storm Mountain. So some education or outreach about those specific policies could be helpful. Additionally, sometimes shelter in place is the recommended option for some community members. And so the recommendation for having a shelter in place skills training was actually brought up by one of the volunteer fire department individuals who came to our community meetings. So again, this recommendation leads directly into people being prepared in the case of an evacuation for a fire. Now, for safety, the second recommendation is also related to evacuation and safety, creating a second access road. So as we mentioned before, Storm Mountain has one single access road. And one of the very most common concerns that community members brought up was that there maybe needs to be a second access road. However, the reason that Storm Mountain does not have a second access road right now are very complex. It's due to cost, but it's also due to the matrix of land ownership, the high effort that is involved to create a second access road. But it probably is possible. It would require a lot of organization, time, and effort. And there would also need to be, community members would also have to agree on the second access road. Because like we've also mentioned, some people like that the community is remote and hard to access. So all in all, this recommendation, it was one of the highest concerns that people brought up. It's also probably one of the most difficult ones to complete, but it would have very high benefits in the case that the only single access road that they have right now becomes blocked during an evacuation. So the other two recommendations, the next two are formal planning documents. Well, the first one's a formal planning document. It's called a Community Wildfire Protection Plan. We've already mentioned it. These are formal plans that are written usually by led by community members in positions of power. They're also, or leadership positions, I should say. And they're written collaboratively with other federal agencies. And they always include a couple of things. They include the values of the community, the risks of the community, and also priorities for action for wildfire mitigation. So written plans are really, CWPPs are really great. Having a written plan that everyone's on board with and aware of can be helpful. It can also be a process to get communities to work with each other, to build networks with other partners. But as long as it's just a written plan, it doesn't actually reduce the community's risk unless action is taken. So that's just something to keep in mind. The last recommendation on this slide is pursuing a FireWise certification. So FireWise is a national level program. Community members can apply to be FireWise certified. There's benefits to that. They can receive access to additional funding and support for other kinds of FireWise annual day events. But of course, there's also some organization that needs to happen for a community to apply to be FireWise. They have to meet the minimum qualifications every year, including individuals doing mitigation action on their land. But that's really what the program is designed to do. It's designed to inspire and to help support individuals make their home more prepared for wildfire and to work with their neighbors to do that as well. Okay, so the last section is educational opportunities. This was actually a pretty wide and branching section, but we can break it down into two main groups. The first one is education targeted at non-community members. And so when we were communicating with community members, they made it clear that visitors or people who are coming into the community to recreate, who were not maybe aware of the wildfire risk, was a big concern. So one way to address that concern, we have a couple of recommendations. One would be to produce signs and to put them in high traffic areas. A second recommendation is also to produce some wildfire risk information to be given to vacation rental by owners or Airbnbs visitors as they come up into the community. The last category, community member focused education. This recommendation also arose from community members' concerns about wanting to share more education. So of course, there's education that could be broad for the entire community, could tie into some of the recommendations Jonah already talked about. But there's also a couple of other specific activities. Communication could be targeted at community members new to the WUI who about how to live in this area of wildfire risk. They could connect with people who've been living there a long time and help build relationships. Additionally, there could be activities targeted at community members who are in the community part-time. And the idea would be to send out mailers and just spread the information and education about what needs to happen in the community and to try to address that gap of the matrix of different land ownership and solve some of the problems there. So.
Yeah, so those are our recommendations. We hope that they help this community better plan for wildfire. It's their option which ones to take on and move forward with. But we do have just a couple of next steps. Really just around distributing the document. Big Thompson Watershed Coalition will be really valuable to us with their networks within the community. They can help distribute that. But we do want to ensure that it goes to the key community members that we identified that attended our meeting, as well as all of the other attendees at our other meetings who indicated that they would be interested in contributing to these processes moving forward. So those are kind of our next steps. And after that, we'll kind of be done with this project, but we want to also go over some recommendations beyond just our deliverable.
Right, for the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition, we had a couple of recommendations for them moving forward with the project. Starting with focusing on spark plugs. We think we've identified some spark plugs within the community. Of course, there may be some others that we haven't reached out to yet, but we recommend for BTWC that as a small organization, they should focus on connecting and building relationships with these individuals who then will be able to use their influence in the community to keep this project moving forward. Additionally, we recommend that they continue to engage and motivate the community. Of course, there are others outreach activities that could be done, and we really hope to see some on-the-ground action happen that will help inspire this process and keep it moving forward. We encourage the use of networking systems the community already has in place. And finally, we recommend that BTWC continues its relationships between itself and some of the other partners. Specifically, like the partners that they already have. It's important to keep that relationship because BTWC as an organization can act as a bridge between community members and these other partners or even federal agencies. And by being able to connect these different groups, they can really increase the community's capacity to do these mitigation events. So we recommend that they prioritize that and keep that in mind as they transition into a new director pretty soon now.
So before we conclude, that kind of finishes up our project portion, but we do want to talk about some areas of reflection and personal growth. And Katie and I had a lot of time to chat about this together, and we did have some common areas that we felt like we both had some personal growth. So we'll talk about those. And the first one is adaptability, being adaptable, one of those key skills that conservation leaders should have. And so there were a lot of times where I think both of us felt pretty stressed out as it felt like our project was kind of evolving almost by the week at some points. And so an example of that Katie talked about already, but when we did these expert interviews and kind of got this information that we ought to step back and consider some more options, that kind of really threw us for a loop because we had focused a lot of our research at that point on community wildfire protection plans specifically. So that was kind of a big step back to broaden our scope, but it was important so that we could give the community more options and so they could choose what's best for their unique characteristics. So adapting to that was a pretty good practice. And then also it was a little bit tough as we were moving through this project. We wanted it all to be based really significantly on all of our findings from the community. So what that meant was we had kind of an unclear idea of what our deliverable would look like for a long time. And as we gained new information and more information came in from the community, we had to kind of find ways to adapt to that and incorporate that into our deliverable. And I think we did a really good job of that. And I think we're proud of how it came out.
Right, and the other major area of us for reflection has to do with stakeholder engagement. Jonah and I felt that those are, again, stakeholder engagement is a very important part for conservation practitioners. And with this project, we had a lot of experience with it, first with our interviews with those expert and practitioners, but especially with all the engagement that we did with community members. So being able to work with the community, do community meetings and get that real world experience was very valuable for us. We feel like our skills have increased and our confidence and our ability to do stakeholder engagement has also increased. Additionally, Jonah and I talked about, we think we're really good partners. But of course, another area of reflection is communication between working on a project like this with each other. We think one of the reasons that we're good partners is because we were able to respectfully disagree with each other sometimes, but it always was respectful. And but it's also important to put our heads together and to find compromises and solutions. And then in the end, we think two heads better than one. We also got experience communicating with each other, collaborating with each other, but also communicating and coordinating with the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition, who's another partner organization. They've got a lot of stuff going on. They're always very busy. So we got some, again, real world experience collaborating with other partners, which again is very important for conservation practitioners. We feel our skills have increased because of that. So with that, we're going to wrap up our presentation with acknowledgements and thank yous. We have a very special thank you to give to the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition. Will and Courtney, thank you so much. It was a pleasure working with you, and we're very grateful for your input for this project. Thanks for everything. We also want to thank a special thank you to the Loveland Fire and Rescue Authority, the volunteer fire department. Their input was critical, and also thank you for letting us use your space for our in-person meeting. The other organizations are also very valuable. Their input could not have been possible without this, for this project would not have been possible without their input. But our last thank you goes to the Storm Mountain community for welcoming us in and for donating their time and their input for this project. Again, we're very grateful for them. And We also want to thank you all for listening to our project presentation. And I think we can take questions now. So with that, thank you.